The fluorescent lights of my corner office hummed with an almost hypnotic persistence as I stared at the rejection email that had just arrived. Another promotion passed over, another opportunity given to someone less qualified but more politically savvy. The bitter taste of repeated failure had become as familiar as my morning coffee, and I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew about success in the modern world. For 28 years, I had operated under the naive assumption that hard work, integrity, and genuine talent would naturally rise to the top. I had been the employee who stayed late, who took on extra projects without complaint, who believed that being nice was somehow synonymous with being valuable. The corporate world, I was beginning to realize, operated on an entirely different set of principles that seemed to reward those who understood the darker aspects of human psychology. It was during one of these moments of professional despair that I stumbled upon Niccolò Machiavelli's The Prince for the second time in my life. The first encounter had been in college, where I had dismissed it as an outdated treatise on political manipulation. Now, reading it through the lens of corporate disillusionment, every page seemed to pulse with uncomfortable truths about power dynamics that I had been willfully ignoring. It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both, Machiavelli had written 5 centuries ago, and, suddenly, I understood why my colleague Marcus, a man of mediocre abilities but exceptional political instincts, commanded respect in meetings while I remained invisible. The realization struck me like a physical blow. I had been playing an entirely different game than everyone else, using rules that existed only in my imagination. The decision to experiment with dark psychology wasn't born from malice or inherent cruelty. It emerged from a desperate need to understand the invisible mechanisms that seem to govern success in environments where human beings gathered in hierarchies. If I was going to continue navigating the corporate landscape, I needed to understand the psychological levers that moved people, not the idealized versions of motivation we learned about in business school, but the raw, often uncomfortable drives that actually influence behavior. My first foray into this darker understanding came through careful observation. I began studying the patterns of interaction in my workplace with the detachment of an anthropologist examining a foreign culture. I noticed how Sarah from marketing could command attention in meetings not through the quality of her ideas, but through subtle psychological techniques that made others feel simultaneously important and slightly off balance. She would begin conversations with personal compliments that felt genuine but were precisely calculated to lower defenses, then introduce her proposals in ways that made disagreement feel like personal rejection. The more I observed, the more I realized that successful people, whether they were conscious of it or not, were already employing principles of dark psychology in their daily interactions. They understood concepts like reciprocity manipulation, where small favors create disproportionate feelings of obligation. They grasped the power of artificial scarcity, making their time and attention feel valuable by being strategically unavailable. Most importantly, they had internalized the fundamental truth that perception often matters more than reality. This realization forced me to confront an uncomfortable question about my own moral framework. Was I choosing to remain powerless in the name of virtue, or was I simply too cowardly to engage with the actual rules of the game? The distinction mattered, because one represented noble sacrifice while the other represented self-defeating delusion. My transformation began with small experiments in psychological influence that felt relatively harmless. I started mirroring the body language of people I wanted to build rapport with, a technique from neurolinguistic programming that creates subconscious feelings of connection. I began using what psychologists call the "but you are free" technique, presenting requests in ways that emphasize the other person's autonomy while making compliance feel like a personal choice rather than external pressure. The results were immediate and unsettling. Colleagues who had barely acknowledged my existence began seeking out my opinions. My suggestions in meetings, which had previously been met with polite indifference, suddenly generated engagement and discussion. I found myself being invited to lunch meetings and after-work gatherings that had been mysteriously absent from my calendar for years. But the real breakthrough came when I decided to test more sophisticated psychological principles during a crucial project presentation. Instead of leading with facts and logical arguments as I had always done, I constructed my presentation around what psychologists call emotional priming, creating specific emotional states in my audience before introducing rational content. I began with a story that generated mild anxiety about market competition, then positioned my project as the solution that would restore security and confidence. The presentation was a triumph. but not in the way I had expected. The decision-makers didn't just approve my project, they expanded its scope and budget beyond what I had originally proposed. More significantly, they began treating me differently in subsequent interactions. I had somehow shifted from being seen as a reliable worker bee to being perceived as someone with strategic insight and leadership potential. This success, however, came with an unexpected psychological cost. As I walked back to my office after the presentation, I felt a strange disconnection from my own identity. The person who had just manipulated a room full of intelligent professionals using carefully orchestrated psychological techniques felt like a stranger wearing my face. I had achieved exactly what I wanted, but the victory felt hollow in a way I hadn't anticipated. The psychological literature on manipulation and influence is vast and often disturbing in its implications. Robert Cialdini's research on compliance demonstrates how easily human beings can be led to act against their own interests through the activation of simple psychological triggers. Stanley Milgram's experiments revealed the frightening extent to which people will abandon their moral convictions when presented with appropriate authority structures. The dark triad of personality traits, narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy, has been extensively studied in organizational contexts, revealing that individuals who score high on these measures often achieve greater professional success, at least in the short term. What troubled me most during this initial phase of experimentation was not the effectiveness of these techniques, but their apparent ubiquity in successful people I had previously admired. I began recognizing the subtle manipulation tactics in the behavior of respected executives, celebrated entrepreneurs, and influential politicians. The charm offensive that preceded difficult conversations, the strategic deployment of vulnerability to create emotional bonds, the careful calibration of praise and criticism to maintain psychological dependency, these weren't anomalies or character flaws, but systematic approaches to human influence that successful people had either learned intuitively or studied deliberately. This recognition forced me to confront the possibility that my previous ethical framework had been not just naive, but actively counterproductive in environments where influence and power determined outcomes. If everyone else was playing by rules I refused to acknowledge, wasn't my moral stance actually a form of unilateral disarmament that guaranteed continued failure? The question became even more complex when I considered the potential positive applications of psychological influence. If I could use these techniques to advance projects that would benefit my colleagues and company, was the manipulation justified by the outcomes? If I could inspire better performance in my team by understanding and leveraging their psychological drivers, was this fundamentally different from any other form of leadership? My exploration deepened as I began studying the neurological basis of influence and persuasion. The human brain, I learned, is not the rational, decision-making machine we like to imagine. Instead, it's a collection of competing systems that evolved in environments very different from modern corporate settings. The limbic system, responsible for emotional responses and social bonding, often overrides the prefrontal cortex's logical analysis when the two systems conflict. Understanding this neurological reality meant that effective influence required appealing to emotional and social drives rather than purely rational arguments. This scientific understanding provided a strange form of moral comfort. If human beings were neurologically predisposed to respond to certain types of influence, then, using these techniques wasn't really manipulation, it was simply effective communication that worked with, rather than against, natural psychological processes. The distinction felt important, even if I suspected I was engaging in sophisticated rationalization. As my experiments continued, I found myself developing what I can only describe as a dual consciousness. Part of me remained the person I had always been, concerned with fairness, motivated by genuine care for others, committed to doing good work for its own sake. But another part of me was learning to see every interaction through the lens of psychological leverage, constantly calculating how to position myself advantageously while maintaining the appearance of authenticity and genuine concern. This psychological splitting created an internal tension that manifested in unexpected ways. I found myself becoming hyper-aware of when others were attempting to influence me, recognizing techniques I had recently learned in the behavior of salespeople, managers, and even friends. The world began to feel like an elaborate theater where everyone was performing roles designed to achieve specific psychological effects, and genuine human connection became increasingly difficult to distinguish from sophisticated manipulation. The first part of my journey into dark psychology had revealed uncomfortable truths about human nature and social dynamics that I could no longer ignore. Success, I had learned, was not primarily about competence or character, but about understanding and leveraging the psychological vulnerabilities that exist in all human beings. The people who advanced in organizations were those who had mastered the art of making others feel important while subtly positioning themselves as indispensable. But this knowledge came with a profound sense of loss. The idealistic worldview that had sustained me through my 20s lay in ruins, replaced by a cynical understanding of human motivation that felt both powerful and spiritually corrosive. I had gained influence and professional advancement, but at the cost of a fundamental innocence about human nature that I would never be able to recover. As I prepared to delve deeper into these psychological techniques, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was crossing a threshold from which there might be no return. The man who had walked into his office that morning, still believing in the possibility of pure motives and genuine human connection, was already gone. What remained was someone who understood the game well enough to play it, but who was no longer certain what victory would actually mean. Part 2, the Machiavellian education. The transformation from naive idealist to calculated strategist doesn't happen overnight. It unfolds through a series of small compromises, each seemingly justified by circumstances, until you wake up one morning and realize you've become someone you wouldn't have recognized a year earlier. My education in the darker arts of human psychology accelerated as I began to see results from my initial experiments, but it also brought me face to face with the profound moral ambiguity that accompanies any serious study of power and influence. The breakthrough moment came during a reorganization initiative that threatened to eliminate several positions in our department. Traditional wisdom suggested that surviving such cuts required demonstrating value through hard work and positive relationships. But my growing understanding of organizational psychology revealed a different approach. The key was not to be valuable, but to be perceived as indispensable while ensuring that others appeared more expendable. I began implementing what Machiavelli would have called strategic positioning. Instead of simply working harder, I started working more visibly on projects that aligned with senior management's stated priorities. I developed relationships with decision-makers not through casual friendship, but through what psychologists call instrumental networking, connections specifically designed to provide mutual value in achieving professional objectives. Most importantly, I learned to shape the narrative around my colleagues' contributions in subtle but decisive ways. During team meetings, I would ask seemingly innocent questions that highlighted gaps in others' knowledge while positioning myself as the person with comprehensive understanding of critical issues. I practiced what influence researchers call competitive altruism, offering help to colleagues in ways that demonstrated my superior capabilities while creating obligations that could be leveraged later. The psychological principle underlying these tactics is what researchers call social proof combined with authority positioning. Human beings naturally defer to those who appear to have superior knowledge or connections, especially when that superiority is demonstrated rather than claimed. By consistently being the person who had answers, who understood the broader context, who could bridge gaps between different departments, I gradually became seen as someone whose loss would create problems that no one wanted to deal with. The reorganization process itself became a masterclass in applied dark psychology. I watched as various colleagues attempted to save their positions through different strategies, most of which were psychologically naive and, therefore, ineffective. Some tried the direct approach, meeting with managers to explicitly argue for their value, a technique that actually triggers psychological reactance by making the power differential explicit. Others attempted to generate sympathy through personal appeals about financial obligations or family circumstances, not realizing that decision-makers in corporate environments are typically motivated to minimize emotional burdens rather than take them on. My approach was different. I positioned myself as an advisor to the decision-makers, offering insights about how different team configurations might work and which skills would be most critical going forward. This strategy accomplished several psychological objectives simultaneously. It associated me with the authority group rather than the potential victims, it demonstrated strategic thinking capabilities that suggested leadership potential, and it created what psychologists call a commitment escalation trap. Once managers had involved me in their decision-making process, removing me from the team would have implied that their own judgment was flawed. The results were exactly what my study of influence psychology had predicted. Not only did I survive the reorganization, but I was promoted to a team leadership position that gave me direct authority over several colleagues who had previously been peers. The moral implications of this success were complex and troubling, but I found myself increasingly able to rationalize outcomes based on systemic rather than personal factors. If organizational restructuring was inevitable, and if someone had to be promoted to fill leadership roles, then wasn't it better for that person to be someone who understood how to use authority responsibly rather than someone who would stumble into power without understanding its psychological dynamics? This promotion marked the beginning of what I now think of as my advanced education in applied Machiavellianism. Having direct authority over other people provides unique opportunities to observe and experiment with psychological influence techniques that are impossible to study from positions of lower status. I discovered that leadership, at least as practiced in most organizational contexts, is fundamentally about managing perceptions and emotional states rather than about making optimal decisions or developing people's capabilities. The first challenge I faced as a team leader was establishing what psychologists call legitimate authority, the sense that my position was earned and appropriate rather than arbitrary or political. This required carefully balancing demonstrations of competence with displays of benevolent concern for team members' welfare. I learned to use what influence researchers call strategic vulnerability, sharing carefully chosen personal information that created emotional bonds while maintaining professional boundaries. More significantly, I began experimenting with sophisticated techniques for managing team dynamics that would have been impossible to implement as a peer. I discovered that people's performance and satisfaction could be dramatically influenced through what psychologists call attribution management, shaping how team members understood the causes of their successes and failures. By consistently attributing positive outcomes to team members' individual capabilities while framing challenges as external obstacles that we could overcome together, I created psychological conditions that enhanced both performance and loyalty. The psychological literature on leadership reveals uncomfortable truths about human motivation that conventional management training typically avoids. People respond more strongly to intermittent reinforcement than to consistent praise, a principle borrowed from behavioral psychology that explains why unpredictable rewards create stronger emotional attachments than reliable ones. Team members develop stronger identification with leaders who occasionally display controlled anger or disappointment than with those who maintain constant positivity, because emotional variability creates a sense of authentic human connection. Most disturbingly, I learned that team members' sense of their own value could be deliberately calibrated through what psychologists call social comparison manipulation. By carefully controlling who was praised publicly, who received challenging assignments, and how different people's contributions were framed in team meetings, I could influence individual team members' self-perceptions and interpersonal relationships in ways that served broader organizational objectives. These techniques worked with an effectiveness that was both gratifying and deeply unsettling. Team performance metrics improved dramatically under my leadership, not because I was making better strategic decisions than my predecessor, but because I was creating psychological conditions that motivated higher levels of effort and collaboration. Team members reported higher satisfaction in anonymous surveys, apparently unaware that their improved experience was the result of deliberate psychological manipulation rather than genuine personal growth or better working conditions. The success brought increasing visibility within the organization, which created opportunities to observe and interact with senior executives whose mastery of psychological influence far exceeded my own. I began to recognize sophisticated techniques that I had previously attributed to natural charisma or exceptional intelligence. The CEO's habit of beginning presentations with self-deprecating humor wasn't random personality, it was a calculated strategy for lowering audience defenses before introducing potentially threatening information. The way senior managers structured meetings to elicit specific outcomes wasn't intuitive leadership, it was applied social psychology designed to manufacture consensus while maintaining the appearance of collaborative decision-making. This recognition led me to study what researchers call executive presence, the collection of psychological signals that create perceptions of leadership capability independent of actual performance or decision quality. I learned that factors like speaking patterns, physical positioning, eye contact duration, and response timing could dramatically influence how others perceived my competence and authority. More importantly, I discovered that these signals could be learned and practiced like any other skill set. The psychological transformation required for this type of strategic self-presentation was more profound than I had anticipated. It required developing what I can only describe as multiple personality modes that could be activated depending on the social context and objectives involved. Meeting with senior executives required a different psychological configuration than managing team members, which was different from negotiating with peers, which was different from presenting to external clients. Each of these modes required not just different behaviors, but different internal emotional states that would generate authentic seeming responses appropriate to the situation. The psychological effort required for this constant adaptation was exhausting in ways I hadn't expected. I found myself feeling disconnected from any stable sense of personal identity, as if I had become a collection of strategic personas rather than a coherent individual. But the external results continued to validate the approach. I was invited to participate in high-level strategic planning sessions typically reserved for more senior personnel. My input was solicited on decisions affecting other departments and business units. Most significantly, I began receiving what organizational psychologists call stretch assignments, projects designed to test leadership potential and preparation for further advancement. The irony was not lost on me that my growing influence was based entirely on understanding and leveraging psychological techniques that most of my colleagues seemed unaware they were being subjected to. I had become fluent in a form of social manipulation that operated beneath the conscious awareness of intelligent, experienced professionals who would have been horrified if they understood the extent to which their decisions and emotions were being deliberately influenced. This realization forced me to confront a fundamental question about the nature of human agency and authentic relationship. If psychological influence techniques were effective primarily because they operated below conscious awareness, then, was any human interaction truly free from manipulation? Were the relationships I was building with colleagues and superiors genuine, or were they sophisticated performances designed to achieve specific outcomes? The question became more complex when I considered that many of the people I was influencing were themselves employing similar techniques, consciously or unconsciously. The senior executives who had taken me under their wing were undoubtedly using their own sophisticated understanding of psychology to manage my perceptions and motivations. The difference was that my awareness of these dynamics was explicit and systematic, while theirs might have been intuitive or learned through experience rather than study. As my second year in the leadership position progressed, I found myself facing increasingly sophisticated ethical dilemmas that had no clear resolution within traditional moral frameworks. When a talented team member was struggling with personal issues that affected their performance, was it more ethical to provide genuine support and accept reduced productivity, or to use psychological techniques to help them compartmentalize their problems and maintain professional effectiveness? When organizational politics threatened to derail a project that would benefit both the company and the team members working on it, was political maneuvering a justifiable means of protecting collective interests? The traditional distinction between manipulation and leadership began to seem increasingly arbitrary. Every effective leader I had observed used psychological influence to achieve outcomes that served broader organizational purposes. The difference between inspiration and manipulation often seemed to depend more on the observer's perspective than on the actual techniques being employed. My growing influence within the organization created opportunities to observe the psychological dynamics of senior leadership that had been invisible from lower levels in the hierarchy. I began attending executive committee meetings where strategic decisions were made, and I was struck by the extent to which these decisions were driven by psychological factors rather than purely analytical considerations. Personal relationships between executives, emotional reactions to past successes and failures, and unconscious biases shaped corporate strategy in ways that would never appear in official documentation. More troubling, I recognized that my own advancement had been facilitated by the same psychological dynamics I was now observing at the executive level. The senior leaders who had sponsored my career progression hadn't chosen me based on objective performance metrics, but because I had successfully created psychological conditions that made them feel confident, validated, and strategically informed. My success was not a triumph of merit over politics, but a demonstration of how thoroughly political considerations could be disguised as merit-based decisions. This recognition brought me face to face with what I now understand to be the central paradox of Machiavellian psychology: the techniques that enable advancement within hierarchical systems also corrupt the systems themselves. By becoming skilled at psychological manipulation, I had gained the ability to succeed within an organizational context that rewarded psychological manipulation. But this success came at the cost of perpetuating and strengthening systems that prioritized psychological gamesmanship over genuine competence or ethical behavior. The second phase of my education in dark psychology had revealed the extent to which sophisticated influence techniques permeated every level of organizational life. I had learned to see through the psychological strategies employed by others while developing my own repertoire of techniques for managing perceptions and emotions. But this knowledge came with a growing sense of spiritual alienation that I was only beginning to understand. As I prepared to move into even more senior organizational roles, I realized that my journey into Machiavellian psychology had fundamentally altered not just my professional capabilities, but my understanding of human nature itself. The idealistic young man who had believed in the possibility of pure motives and authentic relationships was gone, replaced by someone who understood the psychological machinery underlying all human interaction. Whether this transformation represented growth or corruption remained an open question that would define the next phase of my development. Part 3: The Philosopher's Transformation. The ultimate test of any psychological framework comes not in its ability to achieve external success, but in its capacity to create sustainable human flourishing. As my mastery of dark psychology techniques continued to yield professional advancement and material rewards, I found myself confronting profound questions about the relationship between power and meaning that no amount of strategic influence could resolve. The catalyst for this deeper reflection came during what should have been a moment of triumph. I had been promoted to a senior executive position with significant authority over multiple departments and substantial influence over organizational strategy. The promotion ceremony itself was a masterpiece of psychological theater, carefully orchestrated to reinforce hierarchical relationships while creating emotional investment in my success among colleagues who would now report to me. But, as I stood accepting congratulations from people whose emotions I had learned to calibrate like instruments in an orchestra, I felt a profound emptiness that success was supposed to eliminate. The psychological literature on achievement and satisfaction reveals a paradox that becomes viscerally apparent only when experienced firsthand. External validation and material success activate reward systems in the brain that create temporary feelings of satisfaction, but these systems are designed to adapt quickly to new baseline conditions. What psychologists call hedonic adaptation ensures that achievements that once seemed monumentally important become routine experiences that no longer generate positive emotions. More troublingly, the psychological effort required to maintain positions of power and influence often creates stress responses that undermine the very satisfaction that power was supposed to provide. But my discomfort ran deeper than simple hedonic adaptation. The person who had achieved this success felt like a stranger whose motives and methods I could analyze but not admire. I had become extraordinarily skilled at understanding and influencing human psychology, but I had lost touch with my own authentic desires and values in the process. The strategic thinking that had become second nature in professional contexts began infiltrating personal relationships, creating a pervasive sense of disconnection from genuine emotional experience. This psychological fragmentation forced me to confront what philosophers call the problem of personal identity. If our sense of self is constructed from our actions, relationships, and internal experiences, what happens when those actions become primarily strategic performances designed to achieve external objectives? The techniques that had made me successful required constant attention to how others perceived me, but this external focus had gradually eroded my ability to understand what I actually wanted independent of what I thought I should want. The crisis deepened when I began recognizing the same psychological patterns in my personal relationships that I had learned to exploit professionally. Family interactions became opportunities to practice influence techniques. Friendships were evaluated based on their strategic value for career advancement or social positioning. Even romantic relationships were unconsciously structured around psychological dynamics that served my emotional needs while maintaining advantageous positioning for future conflicts or negotiations. This recognition was devastating because it revealed the extent to which dark psychology techniques, once learned, become difficult to compartmentalize. The brain systems responsible for social cognition don't distinguish between professional and personal contexts when processing interpersonal information. The neural pathways that had been strengthened through years of strategic thinking and emotional manipulation had become the default mode for processing all human relationships. But the most profound realization came when I understood that my journey into dark psychology had been motivated not by ambition or greed, but by a fundamental fear of powerlessness that remained completely unresolved despite external success. The techniques I had mastered were elaborate defense mechanisms designed to prevent the kind of professional and personal rejection I had experienced in my 20s. But psychological defenses, no matter how sophisticated, cannot address the underlying insecurities they are designed to protect against. This insight led me to study what psychologists call attachment theory and its relationship to adult behavior in organizational contexts. I discovered that my early experiences of rejection and professional failure had activated primal fear responses associated with social exclusion and abandonment. The dark psychology techniques that had seemed like rational strategies for achieving success were actually unconscious attempts to prevent the psychological pain of rejection by gaining control over social dynamics. Understanding this deeper motivation reframed my entire relationship with the psychological techniques I had mastered. They were not tools for creating authentic success, but elaborate coping mechanisms that had temporarily masked underlying emotional wounds while preventing the kind of genuine human connection that might have actually healed them. The power I had gained was real, but it was being used primarily to maintain psychological defenses that kept me isolated from the authentic relationships that would have provided more sustainable forms of satisfaction and security. This realization catalyzed what I can only describe as a fundamental re-evaluation of the relationship between psychology and ethics. The dark psychology techniques I had learned were not inherently evil, but they became destructive when used as substitutes for genuine personal development and authentic relationship. The problem was not that I understood how to influence people, but that I had forgotten why human connection mattered beyond its strategic utility. The philosophical tradition offers frameworks for understanding this distinction that are absent from purely psychological approaches to human influence. Aristotelian virtue ethics suggests that techniques for influencing others become virtuous or vicious depending on whether they serve human flourishing or merely personal advancement. Kantian moral philosophy provides the categorical imperative, the principle that ethical action requires treating people as ends in themselves rather than merely as means to achieve other objectives. These philosophical frameworks revealed that my mastery of dark psychology had become ethically problematic not because influence techniques are inherently wrong, but because I had been using them without adequate consideration of their impact on other people's autonomy and well-being. The psychological manipulation that had advanced my career had also limited my colleagues' ability to make fully informed decisions about their own professional lives. The emotional bonds I had created through strategic vulnerability were real to the people experiencing them, even though they were calculated performances from my perspective. This recognition led to what philosophers call a moral awakening, a fundamental shift in how I understood the relationship between personal success and ethical responsibility. I began to see that genuine strength required not the elimination of vulnerability, but the integration of psychological sophistication with authentic care for others' welfare. The man who destroys his weak self, I realized, must be careful not to destroy his capacity for genuine human connection in the process. But this philosophical insight created a practical dilemma that had no easy resolution. I was now occupying a senior position in an organizational hierarchy that rewarded psychological manipulation and punished naive idealism. My colleagues and superiors expected me to continue demonstrating the strategic thinking and influence capabilities that had earned my promotion. Suddenly, abandoning these techniques would not only jeopardize my career, but would also abandon the people whose welfare now depended on my organizational effectiveness. The solution, I gradually realized, lay not in rejecting psychological influence techniques, but in reorienting their purpose toward what philosophers call enlightened leadership. This required developing what I can only describe as conscious manipulation, the deliberate use of psychological influence to serve collective welfare rather than purely personal advancement. Instead of using my understanding of human psychology to gain advantages over others, I began using it to create conditions that would enable others to succeed according to their own authentic motivations and capabilities. This shift required developing new psychological skills that were more sophisticated than simple manipulation. I had to learn to understand not just how people could be influenced, but what they genuinely needed for their own development and satisfaction. This meant becoming skilled at what psychologists call perspective taking, the ability to accurately understand situations from other people's viewpoints rather than simply predicting how they would respond to different influence attempts. The practical implementation of enlightened leadership created fascinating psychological challenges. Team members who had become accustomed to being managed through careful emotional calibration initially struggled when I began encouraging them to develop their own decision-making capabilities rather than simply responding to carefully crafted influence attempts. Colleagues who had learned to interpret my behavior through the lens of organizational politics needed time to adjust when I began operating from more authentic motivations. Most significantly, I had to develop what philosophers call moral courage, the willingness to act according to ethical principles even when doing so created personal risks or disadvantages. This required using my understanding of organizational psychology to identify situations where ethical action might appear strategically naive, then finding ways to frame ethical choices in terms that organizational decision-makers could accept without feeling threatened or manipulated. The transformation was gradual and, often uncomfortable. Years of strategic thinking had created neural pathways that made calculating responses feel more natural than authentic ones. Learning to integrate psychological sophistication with genuine care for others required constant conscious effort and frequent course corrections when I found myself slipping into purely strategic thinking patterns. But the results of this integration were profound in ways that external success had never been. Team members began developing their own leadership capabilities rather than simply becoming more sophisticated at responding to my influence attempts. Organizational projects started achieving better outcomes because they were based on genuine collaboration rather than carefully orchestrated consensus. Most importantly, my professional relationships began providing actual emotional satisfaction rather than simply strategic advantage. This personal transformation also revealed new dimensions of what psychological strength actually entails. The weak self that I had spent years attempting to destroy was not my capacity for vulnerability or emotional connection, but my unconscious fears and defensive strategies that prevented authentic relationship. The strong self that emerged from this integration was not invulnerable to rejection or failure, but was secure enough in its core values to risk authentic engagement with others even when that engagement couldn't be strategically controlled. The philosophical implications of this journey extend far beyond individual development. If human beings are fundamentally social creatures whose psychological health depends on authentic connection, then approaches to success that prioritize individual advancement over collective welfare are ultimately self-defeating. The dark psychology techniques that had seemed like sophisticated tools for navigating complex social environments were revealed to be primitive defense mechanisms that prevented the kind of genuine collaboration that creates sustainable success for everyone involved. But this insight also revealed the profound responsibility that comes with understanding psychological influence. Once you comprehend how human minds can be shaped and directed, you become accountable for how that knowledge is used. The psychological techniques remain just as effective whether they are employed for selfish or altruistic purposes, which means that moral character becomes the determining factor in whether psychological sophistication serves human flourishing or undermines it. The journey from naive idealism through Machiavellian manipulation to enlightened leadership had taught me that genuine strength requires not the elimination of ethical considerations, but their integration with psychological sophistication. The man who destroys his weak self must be careful to preserve his capacity for authentic connection, because ultimate success depends not on the ability to control others, but on the ability to inspire and enable others to achieve their own authentic potential. This understanding reframed my entire relationship with power and influence. Instead of seeing them as tools for protecting myself from vulnerability, I began to understand them as responsibilities that required constant attention to their ethical implications. The psychological techniques that had once felt like secret weapons became instruments that demanded careful consideration of their impact on human welfare. The final insight came when I realized that this integration of psychological sophistication with ethical consideration was not a compromise between effectiveness and morality, but was actually the most psychologically sophisticated approach to human influence. People respond more powerfully to leaders who genuinely care about their welfare than to those who simply understand how to manipulate their responses. Authentic concern for others' development creates deeper loyalty and more sustainable motivation than any influence technique that operates through psychological manipulation alone. As I look back on this journey from naive idealism through dark psychology to enlightened leadership, I see that each phase was necessary for developing the psychological complexity required for genuine effectiveness in human systems. The idealism provided moral foundation, the dark psychology education provided technical understanding, and the philosophical integration provided the wisdom to use psychological knowledge in service of human flourishing rather than merely personal advancement. The man who emerged from this process was neither the naive idealist who had believed that good intentions alone would guarantee success, nor the Machiavellian manipulator who had reduced human relationships to strategic interactions. Instead, he was someone who understood the psychological dynamics underlying all human interaction, but used that understanding to create conditions where authentic human potential could flourish. This transformation revealed the ultimate paradox of psychological strength. True power comes not from the ability to destroy others or protect oneself from vulnerability, but from the capacity to create conditions where everyone involved can become stronger and more capable. The man who destroys his weak self without destroying his capacity for genuine human connection becomes truly indestructible, not because he cannot be harmed, but because his strength is based on contributions to human welfare that create lasting positive impact regardless of personal outcomes. The dark psychology techniques remain in my repertoire, but they now serve a fundamentally different purpose. Instead of using them to gain advantages over others, I use them to understand how people can be enabled to overcome their own psychological limitations and achieve authentic success. This represents not the rejection of psychological influence, but its elevation to its highest possible purpose, the creation of conditions where human beings can flourish according to their deepest values and most authentic aspirations. In the end, the Machiavellian education had taught me that genuine strength comes not from eliminating weakness, but from integrating all aspects of human psychology, including its dark dimensions, into a coherent approach to life that serves both individual development and collective welfare. The prince who learns to be both feared and loved, both strategic and authentic, both psychologically sophisticated and ethically committed, becomes truly powerful because his strength serves purposes larger than personal advancement. The journey into darkness had been necessary to understand the full spectrum of human psychological possibility. But the journey back to light, informed by that understanding, created possibilities for human flourishing that neither naive idealism nor cynical manipulation could achieve alone. The man who destroys his weak self while preserving his capacity for authentic connection becomes not just successful, but truly valuable to the human community that shaped him and that he, in turn, has the power to shape.